not just a debate about whether Britain should one day go back into the EU, but he's not even interested in opening up a debate about whether Britain should try to get a deal, a bit like Norway or Switzerland, where it's in an economic area with the EU, where it joins the customs union, the single market. He doesn't want to discuss any of that. Do you think that's a mistake?
I'm not sure it's quite fair, though, if I'm honest, because I think there definitely has been a signalling of a different, less saber-rattling tone.
Well, forgive me, but I'm going to give you a quote from Starmer. Britain's future is outside the EU. It is not in the single market. It is not in the customs union. It is not with a return to freedom of movement. All of those arguments are in the past, where they belong.
Well, I think absolutely. We cannot keep rerunning this debate and ignore some of the other issues that need to be addressed. If Britain does get into that position where we are just constantly debating, then we're not going to move forward. But you mentioned those things. I don't think you can leap back to those things. They have been settled in this period that we're in, but you can have a different relationship with Europe than the one that we've seen in recent times, where it's all about positioning against the French and kind of challenging the Irish government, unhelpful rhetoric when you sit in a position like I do, where we want good relationships with Ireland, a place that has strong bonds with the northwest of England, or we do want to work with our colleagues in Germany as we do. I think we've got to move beyond that phase that we've been in, where there's just this sort of pointless posturing in Europe, and get to a more practical space where we're getting arrangements that work better for people.
Let's just talk, before we end, about the way the Labour Party works, because you're now looking at it from Manchester, not from Westminster. But what we see in London and in Starmer's party headquarters is an obsession with discipline. Jeremy Corbyn, for example, the left of the Labour Party, the leader who, as you just said, in 2019 led Labour to a very significant defeat. He's been told he can't fight his constituency. And people who support him in the party are, it seems, being either rooted out or being told they can't stand for significant position. Do you worry about a witch hunt being led by Starmer and his loyalists?
I worry that things become too factional between both left and right of the party. And I've often felt in my political career that I've lived in the middle of those two groups. I kind of came into politics as somebody who was kind of just, if you like, loyal Labour sort of background, and arrived in Parliament and was a little surprised at times at the kind of ferocity of the sort of toing and froing between, if you like, factions on both sides of the party. And I think the risk in this moment is that the party becomes trapped in that kind of situation and misses people in the middle who want to focus on what it is we need to do to answer the concerns that people here in Greater Manchester and beyond have. So I think the focus needs to kind of stop being internal. It needs to be relentlessly external, and it needs to be about, all sides of the Labour movement starting to pull in the same direction towards, hopefully, a Labour victory in 2024.
Do you think there's a degree of insecurity in the leader's office right now? Not so long ago, you appeared to be blaming unelected people in their 20s and 30s around Keir Starmer, who think they know it all and think they're the bee's knees. It would be nice, you said, to have some support up here in Manchester from the national office.
Well, I think what happens is, because I've been there, is there is an anonymous kind of briefing culture in Westminster that is actually one of the most unattractive things about it.
Have you been briefed against?
Yeah, recently, yes. And
why do you think
that other members of the shadow cabinet, and I'm not going to be
Why do you think they do that in Starmer's?
Well, I was just about to say, I'm not going to be so sort of, kind of po-faced to say it didn't happen in the past. It did happen in the Brown government and the Blair government. It happens, but it's not attractive because, particularly where you've got elected politicians out trying to do a job. I made the point that
support for President Trump that we saw in Miami today, those coming out to defend the former president, that is really strong. And his grasp over the Republican base is really sort of unprecedented in modern history for one person to have such a grasp over one political party like that. So I don't see the Republicans really shifting their rhetoric anytime soon. You can see a number of them sort of dipping their toes in the sort of opposition camp, and especially when the indictment came out. The 49-page indictment was pretty, in the words of President Trump's former Attorney General, pretty damning. It was very detailed. There really was not a lot of room for legal wiggle room. And so a number of politicians who are often former lawyers were highly aware of just how strong this indictment is and tried to sort of distance themselves from the president. But again, they can't deny the political reality that his grasp of the Republican Party remains basically rock solid.
Jared Munshine, thank you very much for joining us on the program.
Thank you.
Now, let's take a look at some other stories in the headlines. The U.S. inflation rate has fallen for the 11th month in a row to 4%. Now, those figures have raised hopes that the Federal Reserve will not raise interest rates later this week. But the update by the U.S. Labor Department also showed that prices in many parts of the economy are still rising steadily. More than 100 people have died in Nigeria after a boat returning from a wedding sank in a river. The vessel was ferrying people from the Kwara state to neighboring Niger state. Police say a search and rescue operation is taking place, but the number of dead may rise further. Malaysia is seeking Interpol's help in tracking down a New York-based comedian who made a joke about the missing Malaysia Airlines flight MH370. The comedian Jocelyn Chia, who was born in Singapore, made what she intended to be a humorous remark about the airline, which disappeared in 2014. These were posted online and have led to backlash in Malaysia. The acclaimed American author Cormac McCarthy has died at the age of 89. Many of his dark and often violent novels focused on life in the frontier in the U.S. Southwest. His best-known works include All the Pretty Horses, No Country for Old Men, and The Road, all of which were made into films. A developing story in the UK. Police in Nottingham say that they're working to establish the motive for the attack, which left 3 people dead and 3 others wounded. 2 19-year-old students and a man in his 50s were stabbed to death. A 31-year-old man has been arrested. Our Midlands correspondent, Navche Johal, has been at the scene.
Police raids in a city reeling from the shock of a major incident that's left 3 people dead and 3 injured. This is where it all began. 2 19-year-old students died here on Ilkeston Road in the early hours of the morning. An eyewitness saw a young man and a young woman being stabbed before the attacker walked off toward the city centre. Police say they believe the suspect then stole a van from a man in his 50s who was also found dead from knife injuries. They say he drove the vehicle to the city centre, where he then drove at members of the public. An eyewitness says she saw a van which hit pedestrians.
A woman went on the curb. The man went up in the air. It was such a bang. I wish I never saw it, because it's really shaken me up.
3 people were injured in the city centre. One of them is in a critical condition in hospital. This is believed to be the van that was used. The emergency services responded by flooding into the area, closing roads and the city's entire tram network. Police have arrested a 31-year-old man on suspicion of murder, and he remains in police custody. They say they aren't looking for anyone else at this time. A student in the city says he saw police just before the arrest.
And I see a police van, a police car even, and a police officer walking alongside the car as it was slowly approaching a white van that had just been parked down the road. And then I heard the policeman shout to the guy in the van to get out of the car, and then proceeded by a sound of a gunshot.
The Home Secretary said police were still working out why this attack took place.
We need to allow the police the time and the space to carry out all of their operational activity to determine the motive. It's right that Nottinghamshire police are working with counter-terrorism policing, but it's also fair to say that everybody and all professionals on the front line are keeping an open mind as to what the precise motive might have been.
One of the victims has been confirmed as Barnaby Webber from Taunton in Somerset. This evening, a vigil took place in their memory at a church in Nottingham. One of those attending had a family connection with one of them.
One of the students that was sadly killed was one of the best friends of my brother's girlfriend. So I've just been on the phone to him and her to offer my condolences, and they're devastated.
Well, the centre of Nottingham is much quieter tonight. The police cordons have all been lifted around here. Details about this incident have unfolded slowly. But on a tragic day for this city, people here are left asking the question, why did this happen? Navtej Johal, BBC News, Nottingham.
Around the world and across the UK, this is BBC News.
Your feet hurt from bunions, even a few steps can feel like a mile. And for the 1 in 4 adults who suffer from bunions, every step may be painful. And if left untreated, bunions only get worse over time. With the old way of doing surgery, bunions often returned. Lapiplasty 3D bunion correction is changing that. Lapiplasty's innovative approach realigns your toe and secures the joint to fix the root cause. There are risks associated with surgery. Find a Lapiplasty surgeon today and learn more at lapiplasty.com.
This program asks plain questions with the help of the unrivaled range of BBC journalists right across the world and gathered here in this building. I'll also draw on my time reporting on global conflict, frontline experience that helps me know who to talk to and who to listen to, meaning our analysis is unbiased with absolutely no spin.
Unspun World on BBC News.
Economically, culturally, politically, or other.
You're live with BBC News. Now to the war in Ukraine, where Russian President Vladimir Putin made a rare admission that his military is short of some high-precision weaponry. Mr. Putin also claimed that Ukraine's counteroffensive has not made progress and that the Ukrainians have suffered heavy losses. However, the head of NATO has given a very different appraisal, saying Ukraine is making advances. James Waterhouse, our Ukraine correspondent, has been given access to one of the area's Ukrainian forces, which has just been retaken.
A journey to a new front line. Only the military can take us this far. Anatoly is leading the way. He's fought against Russian aggression in these parts for 9 years, a battle-hardened soldier who knows this patch. He speeds along scarred roads. It's soon clear Russian forces are far from gone. Rockets, he says, and they're going to hit us soon.
So now Anatoly is putting his foot down. We are speeding through because over the hill are Russian forces where they've just retreated to. We've heard outgoing mortar fire, and what goes out typically comes back. We've just seen incoming fire a few hundred meters away.
The Russians are on higher positions in 3 directions. This is the village of Neskuchna, and it's exposed. Its name means not boring in Ukrainian, an obvious irony for a place part of the Russian front line until 3 days ago. One of 7 settlements recaptured with the start of Ukraine's counter-offensive. The battalion involved lost 6 men in the process, they say. It's not known how many Russians were killed. We chased them out, says Artem. This village was under occupation for 1.5 years. These are Ukrainian lands.
This is what we are talking about with these liberations. Villages where there isn't anyone left, where buildings have either been destroyed or riddled with bullet holes, suggesting close quarter fighting. And it's obvious the Russians are trying to take back what was lost. There's heavy artillery overhead, and this is territory still being closely contested.
Ukraine is hoping to replicate scenes like this elsewhere. But they can be reversed. In neighbouring Makarivka, the Russians pushed back before being repelled again last night. If Ukraine is to achieve its goal, its dream of complete liberation, it may well be complicated and costly. James Waterhouse, BBC News, Neskuchne in eastern Ukraine.
Now let's take a look at some of the stories making headlines in the UK. The investigation into the UK government's handling of the COVID-19 pandemic has ended its first day. The first public hearings focused on how prepared Britain was for a viral outbreak. The lead lawyer said that very little thought was given about what impact it would have on the national lockdown. The UK's police watchdog is investigating 2 officers for possible gross misconduct over an e-bike crash that killed 2 teenagers in Cardiff. The officers drove a van, which was seen following the bike shortly before it crashed. The deaths of 16-year-olds Kyrese Sullivan and 15-year-old Harvey Evans sparked a riot in the Ely area. A mother and her partner have been convicted of killing her 9-year-old son, who died after being submerged in a cold bath in their Worcestershire home. Carla Scott was found guilty of manslaughter of Alfie Steele, while Dirk Howell was convicted of murder. MPs have launched an investigation into school inspections in England and their impact on staff and pupils. The school's watchdog Ofsted announced some changes, but has faced criticism since the suicide of a head teacher whose primary school was being downgraded from outstanding to inadequate. In a BBC interview, Sir Paul McCartney has revealed that artificial intelligence has helped take John Lennon's voice from a demo tape and put it into a track that he said will be the final Beatles record. The song is yet to be released, and even its name is not yet known. But the news comes after 5 decades after the Beatles broke up. Our music correspondent Mark Savage reports.
It's 60 years since Beatlemania swept the UK. John Lennon and George Harrison are no longer with us, but Paul McCartney says the band will release a new song this year, with a little help from artificial intelligence. The song started out in the 1970s with John Lennon sat at a piano like this in his apartment in New York, singing into a tape recorder. On the cassette, his voice is mixed with the sound of the piano chords and the buzz of the electricity mains. But new software, trained on original recordings of his voice, means that we can subtract those other sounds and be left with the pure audio of Lennon's voice.
They tell the machine, that's a voice, this is a guitar, lose the guitar. So when we came to make what will be the last Beatles record, we were able to take John's voice and get it pure through this AI, so that then we could mix the record as you would normally do.
Paul McCartney did not name the song, but it's thought to be Now and Then, a mournful ballad that the Beatles made a failed attempt to record in 1994. Since then, the technology for extracting audio has become much more sophisticated, and it's not just the Beatles who have access to it.
I have a feeling this is the first we'll see of many Beatles tracks, created by fans, perhaps even more created by Paul McCartney himself. It all just depends on the public's appetite for this kind of music and what it is that they want to hear, but really the possibilities with this technology are endless.
And that's a prospect that could keep the Beatles lawyers in business for years to come. Mark Savage,